Hello, comic creators. Welcome back to the Comics Experience Podcast, a podcast where we talk to you about the business and creative aspects of being a professional comic book creator. I'm Gamal, he's Andy, and today we're going to talk about an intertwined topic, something that actually it is a business reality that directly impacts your creative choices and your narrative choices. We're actually talking about today is the concept of story arcs and for all of you who may not be aware of what I mean when I say a story arc means the number of issues that a particular narrative lasts within a comic book series. Now, if you're looking at comic books from a historical perspective, when comics started, the primary source of distribution was newsstands. So a comic book actually needed to be a self-contained story. The beginning, middle, and end had to be in the same comic book. The reason for that is because newsstand distribution was not sequential. So if you were a little kid in the 1950s or the 1960s who went to your newsstand every week, one week you might get Green Arrow, one week you might get Green Lantern, one week you might get Spider-Man, and there was never any kind of rhyme or reason to what books were going to be on in your particular newsstand at the particular time. Andy, do you actually remember this phenomenon before comic shops? Do you now I'm actually
Yeah,
calling you old, yes. But
yeah,
do you
yeah.
remember this?
I do. I do. I was born in a small town in West Virginia, and so there was like a 7-Eleven. I don't remember if
Mm-hmm.
it was actually a 7-Eleven, but it was a convenience store, and they carried comics on the newsstand in there. And my brothers and I would go there, and we would pick out any that we hadn't seen before. And this was kind of after the newsstand heyday. Comic shops existed by this point, but like I remember we would go and we could maybe get issue one of a miniseries, but then issue two might not show up, and then the next one that shows up is issue three because the
Mm-hmm.
people running the 7-Eleven aren't like super conscientious about all this stuff. So yeah, and then actually my small town wound up having a comic shop like pretty early on, and then that made things a lot nicer and easier, and I could ride my big wheel down there.
Exactly. But what it did for the writers, it actually opened up the narrative and gave it a chance to breathe because if the publisher knew that someone could consistently go and get issue after issue, which is kind of the reason why one of the reasons why the direct market started, then they could tell the writer, hey, this story doesn't have to wrap up in 22 pages. You now have 96 pages or 128 pages. So you could add in subplots. You could make the narratives longer. You could have cliffhangers at the end of every issue in ways that didn't make sense when distribution limited your options. And that actually occurred. I know I remember it from the early 1980s up until like the mid 1980s. Then I think it was Marvel that actually started this, the idea of the event. And an event, for all of you who may not be aware, but I'm sure anyone listening to my voice is where there's one singular narrative that is actually dispersed across the entire publishing line of a particular publisher, most notably Marvel, DC, sometimes Valiant, where if you want to get the whole story, you now have to buy all of the issues from all of the different lines that the publisher has. This used to be something that happened in the summer because kids were out of school, they had more time and energy to devote to this sort of thing, and it
Like
was a
reading.
way,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it
That's how my kids are.
exactly, it
Like,
was a
oh,
way
it's
to,
summer, I'm gonna read.
yeah,
Yeah,
but not
yeah.
what they tell you to read at school. um it was also a way to try to get people who were reading one comic maybe to start reading other comics. So if you were an X-Men fan and it was going to cross over with Spider-Man and Daredevil and Hulk and Avengers, maybe you would read one of those. But after the event was over, all the titles would go back to their originally scheduled programming. That actually existed, and that was actually more challenging for from a narrative perspective because you as a writer had to not only consider the story you were telling, but how it may or may not affect all the other books that the publisher may have. So it's a lot more coordination theoretically and a lot more discussion between all of the different writing teams to get everybody on the same page. And Andy, I do not know when this occurred. I'm assuming it's 2012, 2013, but at a certain point, the event became the norm where, especially when you're talking about superhero narratives, comics, they would just go from one event to the next event. I think right now they're in Blood Hunt or something, and DC is like all in, or
Yeah, they're doing Absolute Power right now also.
okay, absolute power. I don't know. All I
Yeah.
know is they've created a situation now where narratively, as a reader, it's more of a jigsaw puzzle. Like I know if I pick up, I don't know, a random issue of Elektra, I also probably have to read Iron Man for no reason of that, no fault of my own, but I have to read Iron Man now to understand what's going on in this. And yeah, it is a thing.
Yeah. So, the one thing I want to add into what you were saying is that um, when they started going serialized, right, and they were being
Mm-hmm.
published each month, and people could go in and they could go issue to issue to issue, that one of the things that happened fairly naturally is the writers and artists developed the ABC plots, right? So there
Mm-hmm.
was like, and the way it worked for a long time, generally speaking, was like your A plot was what your story, your one single issue was really about. And that one usually concluded while the B plot was rising. So that the next issue, it was a cliffhanger and became the A plot the following
Mm-hmm.
issue. And then the C plot, which had been introduced, is now the B plot. And there's a new C plot. And it would just sort of like an ongoing escalator, right? So there was
Mm-hmm.
always this A plot that would climax in the issue and then a cliffhanger. Um, a little bit oversimplifying, but that was sort of it. And then what they started doing was they realized like, hey, if we take some of these old comics, like it's like our most famous X-Men stories that we keep referencing over and over and over and over, like the
Mm-hmm.
Dark Phoenix saga,
Mm-hmm.
we can collect that into a trade paperback and we can sell that and they will continue to sell forever. But the problem with that, I don't know if you've ever sat down and read that collection, is that the Dark Phoenix saga is not like a thing that you just sit down and read. It's multiple stories that kind of
Mm-hmm.
do this rising action thing. And then when they started doing crossovers, it became even trickier to collect things into a trade paperback form because now you have to collect multiple issues of multiple series that have, B plots from the actual series
Mm-hmm.
along with the A plot of the event. And so once trade paperbacks started to become a really big part of that comic book business, they again affected how stories were told. So when you and I were at Marvel and I was editing, like we were told that each trade paperback had to have that beginning, middle, and end. It was like we've
Mm-hmm.
come full circle. And you could design a trade paperback that would be sort of the Civil War trade paperback,
Mm-hmm.
and it could be giant and collect everything in omnibus form, or it could be smaller and collect just the core story. So it really did start to affect how stories were being told from sort of a format standpoint.
Well, okay. Then the question becomes, as an educator, how do you train a writer who may or may not be familiar with other disciplines of writing? Because writing for comics is very different than writing for film or writing for prose. How do you train them to understand how those, like, for example, the ABC plot thing, how do you explain that in relation to inciting incidents and climaxes and beats and scenes and all that kind of stuff?
Right. So, what we offer from a course standpoint is we have a digital bundle right now, the Intro to Comics Writing bundle, which gives you that foundation. It gives you the story, the inciting incident. It talks about developing characters and all this stuff, and and it gets you to focus your story down, so that you can tell your story. And we recommend a 5-page story because that's actually harder than a longer story.
Mm-hmm.
But that gets you your that gets you to the point where you are now writing comics. What we just launched recently is Fred Van Lente, who's been a professional comics writer for decades now. He's awesome. Has got a course up that we just launched. If you're listening to this the week that we recorded, it's actually on sale right now, called Comics Writing Story Arcs and Ongoing Series. And so it takes writing through what does it mean to write a story arc, right? Like,
Hmm.
so the one that gets referenced the most for me is people pitch me comics all the time. They're like, it's like Hellboy in that each 4 to 6 issues is a complete story, but then it's a series of mini series that are a series of trade paperbacks, and then
Mm.
they also built, which is again full circle yet again to going into that ongoing series sort of mentality.
Right.
But now we're doing it in story arcs instead of single issues. So, and he goes through how to outline story arcs, how to outline ongoing series, how to build them, and work students through that. It's a really cool class, but I think for comics, because all of these modes, all of these sort of formats,
Hmm.
I'm just kind of struggling to find the right systems maybe for telling your stories. They all kind of fold in on each other. And
Yes.
so for writing comics, it's really helpful and beneficial to understand how they all work and to be able to do all of them. Like when I get asked to write for a publisher, it's not always the same thing. Like sometimes it's a one shot where it's just there's no continuation. It's just
Mm.
one and done and that's
Mm.
it. Sometimes it's a prequel, sometimes it's a story arc, sometimes it's an ongoing series. One of the things that I think was really interesting and in the early 2000s is as Marvel and DC really went hard into like building for the trade paperback.
Yes.
Um, there was an independent creator who was very much not doing that, and he was writing very much monthly comic, always end on a cliffhanger,
Mm.
never finish the whole thing, and build, always be building and building and building. He was doing that with Invincible, and he had just launched The Walking Dead.
Hmm.
And both of those comics do that. You can read them in trade paperback, but they are constantly building in a way that superhero stories had stopped for a while.
Right.
Um, and part of that is counter programming. Everybody was doing one thing. He was the only guy kind of, he was the only game in town kind of doing the other thing still. And so
Mm.
his books in in part, that helped his books, I think, take off the way that they did. And now, both are hit television shows and all that, and all that kind of stuff. So understanding not only just the forms,
Mm.
but also understanding when and how to use them, really effectively, whether you want to lean into kind of where the business is going or you want to counter program the way Kirkman did in that case, um, is kind of, it's up to you. It gives you more variety, it gives you more choice, and it gives you more flexibility.
Yeah, and I think that flexibility is clearly very important if you're going to be writing on a freelance basis because you're going to have to
Right.
adapt to whatever the publisher needs and write in that structure for their publishing plan. My question is if you're an independent publisher or you're an emerging publisher, how do you decide which format, which means which writing style makes more sense for you? If you already know that you can write in whatever structure you need to write depending on those circumstances, how do you make that business decision relative to your creative decision?
Um, Man, that's a really good question. Um, a lot of it just comes down to well, I mean, it comes down to two things. In an ideal world, it would simply come down to what suits the project the best,
Right.
right? Um, we've never lived in an ideal world, and we're probably not going to start anytime soon. So the other thing that comes in is money, right?
Mm-hmm.
What can you afford to do, and for how long can you
Mm-hmm.
sustain it? Because part of the business model of comics, at least in the direct market, selling to comic shops, like we've been talking about, is that sales erode over time on an ongoing series.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them, Marvel and DC, are constantly trying to find ways to fight, and they goose numbers for a while, and they wind up going back down and all that kind of fun stuff. But there comes a point where even if the book is a success, there will come a point, theoretically anyway, where sales decline to the point where it's no longer even profitable, much
Hmm.
less making much money. It's now making no money or even losing money. And usually around that point is when people start to want to find other things to do. So, like I said, a lot of people kind of plan for like a mini series or a single graphic novel with the idea that, oh, and then we can do more. It's set
Hmm.
up to do more. I actually just finished, or I'm close to finished working on one that's like that. Um, because you don't know until you go to market and you start selling it and you see if there's traction. Um, you don't really know how long to do it. So you're trying to hedge your bets. Like I'll tell a complete story and this is all I ever get to do, then at least we got one good complete story that's fulfilling for the audience. If it's a hit, then we can do more and we can pick up where we left off and the seeds of this are
Hmm.
are in it. And that's another, I mean, that's an art form fairly unique to comics. I mean, movies have started to pick up on it, but they do it really poor. Not to say that comics always do it great, but a lot of movies do it very poorly to where it winds up undermining the film itself. That's a whole other conversation,
Yeah, yeah, where they're trying to build for a franchise without actually establishing the foundational story first. I
though.
wanted to ask a little bit about because in the Franco-Belgian market and in the Korean market where you have like a webtoon structure or the Japanese market where you have a manga structure, their formatting of how long each story is and how that impacts the arc is a little bit different. Do you think like I'm at least for the past couple of years been very attracted to the books coming out of Europe, where it's kind of like a 48 to 64 page book,
Yeah,
but it's pretty much a one shot. And then
yeah,
they may come out with another one shot a year later, a year and a half later, but it's also going to be 64 pages, which is, I can't call it a graphic novel because I think it's too short. And it's not a single issue because it's too long. So the term that I've heard is graphic album. Do you think that there is a space for that in, I'm assuming a lot of people, well, I'm not assuming based on the YouTube and, podcast numbers, most of our audience is in America. So do you think
yeah,
there's a space for that type of format here,
yeah, yeah. There
especially if you have
is.
crowdfunding to.
Yeah, I know there. I mean, I know there is because with CEX with the publishing company,
Mhm.
we've done it. We've dabbled in one shots that are around 20 to 30 pages. We've done some that are a little larger, and they they do work. I mean, as long as they're good and you
Mhm.
promote them properly, they work. And it's it's actually a model that I'm really attracted to right now because I don't, I mean, I run into people all the time. They're like, oh, I need 6 issues to tell this story. Like, you don't. You really don't. Like,
Okay, how do you think they come to that conclusion, and how do you come to the counter conclusion that 6 issues or 4 issues is what's required for a particular story?
well, I mean, there's a number of there's a number of ways they can come to that conclusion. There's a number of ways I can come to my conclusion. But
Mhm.
generally speaking, people that get really into their stories, like they'll come up with a bunch of subplots and they'll come up with these scenes that are cool, but they're not really integral. And they often have a lot of scenes or even characters that can and probably should be combined into one. There's a lot of like repetitiveness. And
Mhm.
so, one of the jobs as an editor, which is really where I started before I was a publisher and a educator and a printer and all these other things, um, was in trimming fat. Like
Mhm.
that's what you do. You look at it and you go, oh, okay, yeah, in 6 issues, this will be good. If we trim away the fat and it's all meat, then it'll be really good for 4 issues and
Mhm.
sustainable and also a lot easier to sell. And you don't have the sales decline over those last 2 issues, and your trade paperback is at a better price point. So it also functions from a business standpoint. But I've had people pitch me things that were 6 issues, and I've said, yeah, this is maybe a double size one shot. Like you can do this as a double size one shot, and it'll work better. Um,
Mhm.
I have on occasion had people say I want to do it as a one shot, and me say, yeah, you've packed too much in here. It really needs to be longer. But that's rarer. Um, yeah, and it's just looking at the story and going, this could be tighter, this could be cleaner, it could be stronger. And what you're trying to do is make it stronger, not shorter. You just
Mm-hmm.
want it to be stronger.
Mm-hmm.
Side effect of that is that it's usually shorter.
Yeah, I know, like from my standpoint, because I come at it from just the business and economic standpoint. Whenever a client comes to me and says they really want to do a graphic novel, but it's their first project out of the gate, my
Yeah,
recommendation is always, okay, you don't have the time, the money, the distribution system, or the team set up to do the graphic novel. And a lot of times I think certain creators focus on a format because they're imagining a scene, and that scene is them walking into the comic shop and seeing all of their issues on the shelf,
right.
and that's how they came to the conclusion it needs to be 6 inch. Or they have four really good ideas for covers, and then they say, well, it has to be 4 issues so I can get all the four covers into the thing. Or some people like, they've read, they've read Watchmen or they've read Dark Knight or whatever.
Right.
So now it has to be a graphic novel because what inspired them was a graphic novel. Okay, your story may be an ongoing series. I don't know, but I come at it from, okay, do you have the resources to make the thing you want? Not just what thing do you want? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's also, that's a big limiting factor. I mean, that's probably the biggest limiting factor is resources, right?
Hmm.
Because the conventional wisdom for a long time was, well, it's cheaper to make a comic than it is to make a movie, except that comics don't make great movies. Like, don't take your film script and just
Hmm.
build a comic off of it. Like there's a process to doing an adaptation properly. But yeah, they're still expensive. Like they're not cheap. Like I have a side hustle I do, and the funds of that side hustle go into the make comics fund. Like that's the money that I can. That's my I get to play with that money,
Hmm.
and it takes a long time for that bank account to build up to the point where I can fund a project. It's certainly not something that I even do in a single year. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So I think the conclusion that we've come to is writing for comics requires an analysis of not just what the story requires, but what the market requires and what your resources require. And if you take Fred's course or you take a look at the comics experience bundle, you could at least wrap your head around all the different narrative and creative decisions that have to be made and the skills that have to be developed. So when you are faced with your book or the book from your client, you could actually match the arc and pace of the narrative to the business realities of the book that's coming out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
I
Yeah,
think I got
think that's where we landed. Yeah,
it.
I think you summarized that well, Kamal.
All
I'm
right.
really proud. I'm
Well,
really proud of you.
very good. Very good. All right. Well, then I'm not doing any more work for the day. I'm done because it's not going to get any better from here.
No.
Um, we're going to have links to the classes that Andy spoke about in the show notes. We are going to also have if you're listening to this when it comes out, we're going to have our weekly live Q&A session for Community Pro members tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. We are also going to make an announcement that we're going to bring back our expert interview series later this month, and we are going to announce our very special guest probably within the next 24 to 48 hours. So keep on the lookout for that. So until the next time, and the next time we have this podcast will probably be after New York Comic Con because we'll be too tired to do it before then. Until the next time, I'm Gamal. He's Andy, and have fun with your comic.